Hello everybody, welcome to Little Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel and drop a like on this video. And I'm trying to hit 50k subscribers over here, so that subscription would be much appreciated. I cannot tell you how tempting it is every single time to say, and we're available over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you would like it. We're not, only on Rusty Buckets. I wanted to do a series debating who is the best player in different franchises, NBA history. It depends. Of course, there are certain franchises who there is a very concrete answer to that question, but there's a couple of different teams where that is very much not the case. And I think maybe the most interesting franchise for this very question is the Toronto Raptors, because the Toronto Raptors basically have four different candidates for the greatest Toronto Raptor of all time that all have pretty distinct and different cases for it. And I think your answer to this question kind of is more of a reflection of what you value as a basketball fan, what you value in basketball players, and then also just the time in which you watched them play. Because I think older fans, older Raptors fans, older NBA fans will say that Vince Carter is the greatest Toronto Raptor of all time, because when you think of the Toronto Raptors, for many people, he is the answer to that, because, I mean, they weren't really jack or shit before he was there. He elevated that franchise to the next level by just being such a freak athlete, such an exceptionally fun player to watch, the human highlight reel. But he was not much of a winner. He also left them pretty early on, and there's a case to be made that Vince Carter is among one of the more disappointing players of all time, just given how highly he was projected after some of the earlier years in his career. You know, there's people who would argue that Vince had GOAT potential, or like nearing Michael Jordan level or Kobe Bryant level potential, but he never really reached that threshold, especially on the defensive end of the floor. But offensively speaking, he ended up being a great three-point shooter, excellent mid-range shooter, and then obviously the freak athlete you know him to be. But the Raptors did not experience a crazy amount of success with them there. However, no one even fucking heard of the Toronto Raptors before he was there. So he gets a lot of credit for that. However, to say he's their best player is definitely untrue. You know, being the best, or rather greatest player in a franchise's history is not necessarily strictly about who the better basketball player is, because I do think a prime Vince Carter is better than DeMar DeRozan or Kyle Lowry, who are two of the other names available on this list as basketball players, but I don't quite know if that means that he eclipses them on the all-time Raptor status, because both of them played a significantly longer period of time with the Raptors. And honestly, between DeRozan and Lowry, part of it is just that Lowry was there for longer, not that that was up to DeMar DeRozan. But the other thing is, like, when I said it kind of reflects on what you value in basketball players. I think who you thought was the better player when both of them were at their peak on the Raptors, between Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan, very strongly reflects what you value in basketball players. And for me, the answer at the time when I was younger was DeRozan, because I just saw a guy who played like Kobe and I was like 17, 18, 19. So I was like, yeah, that guy's obviously the better player. But as I grew to appreciate some of the smaller nuances of the game, when I grew to appreciate guys having a more all-around game, Kyle Lowry became the pretty clear, distinct answer there between those two. So Kyle has the extra time there, and he has the more all-around game that I think overall made him a better player, but he didn't score at the level that DeMar DeRozan does. And of course, nothing gets valued in this game more than high-volume scoring, and DeMar DeRozan absolutely did that. But I think the most common answer would be Kyle Lowry between those two, because of the more prolonged period, and I personally believe he was the better player. So at that point, because they're kind of paired together, I would say that the next interesting thing is it comes down to really three. DeMar DeRozan we can nix from this list, Vince Carter, Kyle Lowry, and then Kawhi Leonard. And that is once again an interesting reflection of what you value, because Kawhi Leonard literally played in Toronto for one fucking season. That is as minimal as it could possibly be. And in spite of how little amount of time he ended up being in a Raptors jersey, he did more with it than any of the other three guys that we mentioned. Kyle Lowry was, of course, a part of that championship run, and he definitely was the most consistent version of himself because both DeRozan and Lowry were horribly inconsistent offensive players throughout their earlier runs together, but Kawhi Leonard was the guy who was capable of getting them over that hill in a way that I didn't think was going to happen anytime soon. If you would have asked me, are the Toronto Raptors winning a championship anytime soon after they got swept in 2018 after having, I think, their best record in franchise history, I would have said they were not going to be there anytime soon. But then, of course, the Kawhi Leonard-DeMar DeRozan trade went down, and while I did not have them winning the title, at the very least, pretty much everyone considered them contenders, but I believe they still had like the 4th or 5th best championship odds heading into those playoffs, because even though Kawhi was relatively healthy during the regular season, you still didn't really trust him to be healthy for a prolonged period of time because he had trouble with that after returning from the Zaza Pachulia injury, and there was just a lot of doubt. And you can also be reductive about it and be like, well, they probably don't win that championship if Kevin Durant doesn't tear his Achilles and is healthy throughout the entirety of the series, not just coming back in like game 3 or 4, whichever one it was, where he immediately hurt himself after like 12 minutes. Sure, there are things that you can use to take away from that Raptors team. And if you want to do stuff to take away from Kawhi specifically, I do think he gets a little bit, just a smidge too much credit for this championship, just because there was a great core built around them. The really only issue that existed was that DeMar DeRozan wasn't Kawhi Leonard. Like after that, there was also Pascal Siakam having the breakout season, of course, which also played into this thing, but like it is definitely not quite a carry job championship, but we are talking about a dude who averaged 30 throughout the entirety of the playoffs, and he actually had one of the higher point per game championship runs in NBA history. It was like him, Michael Jordan, and like Shaq who were on that list. I'm sure there's some other people who I'm blanking on, but like in terms of taking it all the way, he had one of the greatest individual runs, individual playoff series ever, while paired with a really excellent team. So do you value the guy who brought them a championship, but also said, fuck this place, I'm out right after it? So clearly somebody who did not embrace the city, did not embrace the franchise. Or do you give it to Kyle Lowry, who has this super long tenure and is probably, in terms of if you're factoring in longevity, the most important player in Raptors franchise history? But if you're factoring in just the putting the Raptors on the map, then you can give it to Vince Carter. And I don't think Kyle Lowry is anywhere near Vince Carter or Kawhi Leonard at the peaks of their talents. So I don't know. The Toronto Raptors question is interesting. I think for me, I have always said Kawhi, and that is obviously coming from the perspective of a Bulls fan who doesn't know what it is like to be in that specific scenario. But I will say, given that if the Bulls didn't have any championships, but also it doesn't really make much of a fucking difference to me because I didn't see it when I was alive. Obviously, I wouldn't say if somebody won a championship with the Bulls and then left, they would be the best player in their franchise history because of the previously established stuff. But just from my point of view, he would be the most important player in my lifetime. And I would consider him the greatest player in my lifetime, but of course there was also not a player. I don't know. I'm getting lost in this. My point being, if I had a franchise that hadn't won a championship and someone got traded there and they won that championship, I would give them the nod. Kyle Lowry was also there for that championship though, and he was kind of tied with Siakam depending on the game, depending on the series, for being the second and third or third best player in that playoff run. So you can also give Kyle Lowry that edge because he has the championship too, but he wasn't so clearly integral in winning it in such an obvious way in the way that Kawhi Leonard was. So I don't know. I really don't have a super strong answer to this question, but I lean Kawhi. But you could also ask me later in the week and I'm like, man, but Kyle Lowry was there so long, or man, but Vince Carter put them on the map and is like probably the most iconic Toronto Raptor of all time. Kawhi also has the most iconic Toronto Raptor play of all time. So I think my answer is Kawhi, but I also don't think there is a wrong answer, and I would love to hear, for those of you who disagree, who would say it's Lowry, or if you'd say it's DeRozan or Vince. I would love to hear why you feel that way. Let me know in the comment section down below, but that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.
It's Marc Gasol.